July 4th, 1910. The Nevada desert is cooking. The air shimmers like it's boiling, and 20,000 hearts, packed into an arena under a scorched sky, are beating in the same nervous rhythm. Because this isn't just a fight. To white America, it's a rescue mission. They found their champion, their answer, their savior. Jim Jeffries, the great white hope, dragged out of retirement for one purpose: put a black man back in his place. And what better day to do it than America's birthday? But then the camera finds him, Jack Johnson, heavyweight champion of the world, and he's smiling like a man who already knows the ending. Not a nervous smile, not a polite smile. That gold tooth, don't need your permission smile. Because Jack Johnson doesn't fear Jim Jeffries. He doesn't fear the crowd. He doesn't fear the pressure of a whole nation staring at him, praying he loses. And in a few hours, he's going to prove it. 2 men, 1 ring, a nation holding its breath. Because deep down, everybody understands what this really is: a fight for a title and a fight for the myth of white supremacy itself. But to understand why one man's smile could make America shake, you have to go back, way back, before the bright lights, before the belts, before the headlines and the hate. Back to the docks, back to Galveston, Texas. In the dying days of the 19th century, on the bustling waterfront of Galveston, a legend was being forged, not in a gym, but in sweat, salt, and survival. Jack Johnson's story didn't begin in a boxing ring. It began in the humble home of 2 former slaves. The year was 1878. America was still bleeding from the Civil War, trying to stitch itself back together while refusing to treat black people like human beings. Freedom existed on paper, but the danger lived in the streets. Young Jack learned early, life wasn't fair and it wasn't safe. As a teenager, he worked the docks, backbreaking labor, loading cotton bales, hauling freight, fighting exhaustion, fighting hunger, and fighting the ever-present rats that crawled through the shadows like they owned the place. His hands didn't toughen from gloves, they toughened from work. But the sea air carried more than the salt of the Gulf. It carried possibility. And fate had different plans. In the shadowy back rooms and makeshift arenas around Galveston, Jack stumbled into a brutal world most people today wouldn't even believe was real: the battle royale. Not a tournament, not sports, not honor, a spectacle. White spectators would throw multiple black fighters into a ring at once, men desperate for money, for opportunity, for survival, and then bet on who would be the last one standing. It was violence turned into entertainment, a cruel reminder of the world Jack lived in. But for Jack Johnson, it became his first stepping stone to greatness. Because what set Johnson apart wasn't just power, it wasn't just size, it wasn't just courage, it was his mind. While other men treated boxing like street brawling, Johnson treated it like chess, like art, like science. He developed a defensive style so smooth, so controlled, so humiliating for opponents that they'd swing hard only to hit nothing but air. His footwork wasn't clumsy, it was graceful, almost like a dancer sliding across the floor. His jab wasn't wild, it was precise, like a surgeon's scalpel. And in an era where black fighters were expected to be crude sluggers, expected to be reckless and animalistic, Johnson did something that terrified people even more than his fists. He defied the stereotype. He was patient. He was technical. He was smart. And he didn't just want to win, he wanted to control you. He wanted to make you miss, make you doubt, make you look foolish, make you realize, round by round, that you were in there with a black man who wasn't afraid and wasn't impressed. Back in 1909, man, Jack Johnson was the greatest. He had to be the greatest. The young fighter from Galveston wasn't just chasing titles. He was chasing recognition in a world that refused to see him as an equal. Every punch he threw carried the weight of Black America's struggle. Every victory was a slap in the face to the racism of the era. But the real battle, the one that would shake the entire country, was still ahead. Because in the early 1900s, the heavyweight championship wasn't just a sporting prize, it was a symbol of dominance, a symbol of superiority, a symbol. White America was not willing to let a black man hold at any cost, and that's where the real war begins. In the early 1900s, the heavyweight championship wasn't treated like a belt, it was treated like a crown, and in white America's mind, that crown didn't just represent boxing greatness, it represented racial order. For decades, white champions hid behind what everyone called the color line, an unwritten rule that was enforced like law. Black fighters could fight each other. They could entertain crowds. They could fill arenas. But they could not, under any circumstances, challenge for the heavyweight championship. Not because they weren't good enough, because the people in power were terrified of what it would mean if a black man became the recognized baddest man on earth. It wasn't just discrimination. It was fear dressed up as tradition, because if a black champion stood on top of the world, it would shatter the myth that white supremacy needed to survive. And the color line in boxing wasn't separate from society. It was a perfect mirror of Jim Crow America. On paper, black people were free. In reality, the rules were enforced with intimidation, violence, and selective justice. Black men were punished for looking proud, for voting, for owning land, for speaking too loud, for existing in the wrong spaces. And the heavyweight title, because it symbolized physical dominance, was one of the most sacred symbols white America clung to. So champions protected it. Before Tommy Burns, white champions simply refused to fight black challengers. They claimed it would cause racial unrest. They insisted it would provoke riots. But what they really meant was this: a black heavyweight champion would provoke reality. And reality was the one thing they couldn't tolerate. Then Jack Johnson showed up, and he refused to accept the barriers. He refused to accept the excuses. He refused to accept the lies. When Tommy Burns claimed the heavyweight crown in 1906, Johnson began a pursuit so relentless it became legendary. He didn't just call Burns out from afar. He followed him across the world, from London to Paris, from Vancouver to Sydney. Johnson shadowed Burns like a storm cloud you can't outrun. And wherever Burns fought, wherever cameras flashed, wherever crowds gathered, Jack Johnson would stand up and challenge him publicly. No whispering, no politeness. He'd rise in the crowd and announce it like a sentence: "Fight me." Burns tried to dodge it. The boxing world tried to ignore it. But the pressure kept growing, because Johnson wasn't just a contender. He was the contender. Too big, too skilled, too dangerous to pretend he didn't exist. And finally, half a world away, an Australian promoter named Hugh McIntosh made Burns an offer so enormous it shook the sport: $30,000. At that time, it was the largest purse in boxing history. Burns couldn't ignore money like that. But even then, he tried to protect himself with conditions. He demanded a bigger share of the purse than the challenger. He demanded approval of the referee. He demanded concessions designed to remind everybody who was supposed to be in control. And Jack Johnson, he accepted every demand, not because he was desperate, Because he understood something most men don't. Sometimes you take the unfair deal because you know you're about to break the whole system anyway. Sydney, Australia, December 1908. The fight finally happens, and the moment the bell rings, you can feel it. This is why they were afraid. Johnson's height, Johnson's reach, Johnson's composure. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't brawl. He dominated Burns with such ease that the champion looked helpless, like a man who realized too late that his protection was just paper. Johnson picked him apart, and between punches, he did something that made it worse for the crowd. He talked. He taunted Burns, calm, smiling, in control, like he was teaching a lesson in public. At one point, he mocked him openly. Poor Tommy, who taught you to fight like that? It wasn't just physical domination, it was humiliation. And by the later rounds, Burns was being beaten so badly, the authorities stepped in. The police stopped the fight in the 14th round, but by then, it didn't matter. The color line had been shattered. Jack Johnson was heavyweight champion of the world, and the shock waves weren't limited to boxing. They ripped through the entire country. Because white America didn't just lose a fight, they lost a symbol, and they immediately began searching for a way to take it back. That's when the call went out. Not from a gym, but from the culture itself. The writer Jack London gave voice to what many white Americans were thinking when he demanded that Jim Jeffries come out of retirement and remove what he called that golden smile from Jack Johnson's face. It wasn't really about a belt anymore. It was about erasing the image of a black man standing tall, smiling, unbothered, while the world raged around him. The search for a great white hope had begun. And Jack Johnson, he wasn't done smiling, not even close. But Jack Johnson's reign as champion wasn't just a problem because he won. It was a problem because of how he lived after he won. Because for white America, there was an unspoken rule they expected black success to follow. Win, but don't look too proud. Be great, but stay humble. Achieve, but don't challenge the order. And whatever you do, never act like you're free. Jack Johnson did the opposite. He didn't just hold the heavyweight title. He carried it like a statement. And the real outrage wasn't only what he did in the ring, it was what he did outside of it. Johnson refused to play the role of the acceptable black champion. He dressed too sharp. He spoke too boldly. He spent too loudly. He laughed too freely. And most of all, he did something that sent white newspapers, politicians, and ministers into a panic. He openly dated white women, not in secret, not hidden away, openly, deliberately. And the media treated it like war. One of the most talked about relationships was with Belle Schreiber, a white woman from Milwaukee, described in the press as a former prostitute. The newspapers of the day turned vicious. The Chicago Tribune branded Johnson a defiler of white womanhood. The New York Times repeatedly framed his relationships as scandalous, offensive, and dangerous to white sensibilities. But the relationship that triggered the biggest national eruption was with Etta Duryea, a white Brooklyn socialite. When Johnson married her in 1910, headlines across the country exploded. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It became a political and social crisis. The Pittsburgh Gazette described the marriage as a complete defiance of racial barriers. In major cities, white citizens organized protests denouncing Johnson's lifestyle. In Norfolk, Virginia, a group of ministers petitioned Congress to ban interracial marriage nationwide. In Atlanta, religious leaders pushed boycotts of Johnson's fights, and the more they screamed, the more Johnson leaned into it. His response was never to apologize. It was to live even bigger. He bought faster cars, wore more expensive suits, smiled wider, because the smile wasn't just confidence, it was a message. You don't own me. And that message made the country furious. The tension didn't stay in the newspapers. It spilled into the streets, especially after Johnson's fights. When Johnson defeated Stanley Ketchel in 1909, violence erupted. Riots broke out in New York and Philadelphia. White mobs stormed black neighborhoods, attacking people and burning homes and businesses. In Houston, 3 black men were killed for celebrating Johnson's victory too publicly. In New Orleans, police had to break up crowds of white men literally hunting for black citizens who dared show pride in Johnson's success. That's the atmosphere Jack Johnson ruled in. Not just hostility, blood in the streets for celebrating him. And yet Johnson refused to shrink himself. He drove purple cars. He wore elegant suits. He walked into the finest restaurants in Chicago, often with a white woman on his arm. And when they refused to serve him, he didn't beg. He didn't argue. He humiliated them. The Chicago Defender reported that Johnson once purchased an entire restaurant just to be served a cup of coffee. Think about what that meant in Jim Crow America. A black man walking into a space built to exclude him, and instead of leaving, buying it. That kind of defiance wasn't just controversial. To many white Americans, it was intolerable, because Johnson wasn't only winning, he was winning without permission, and the more he lived like a free man, the more the pressure grew to erase him. So the Great White Hope Search became a national obsession. Newspapers framed it like destiny. America needed a white champion to restore the natural order, and the man they chose, the man they begged to come back, was the retired former champion, Jim Jeffries. As fight day approached, the tension reached a fever pitch. Special trains arrived in Reno, Nevada, packed with spectators. Some carried signs that weren't even trying to hide the hatred. Signs that read things like, "Save the white race," "Kill the golden smile." That's what they came for, not a sporting event, a spectacle of racial revenge. And Johnson, he kept smiling. He rode through Reno in his flashy car with his white wife, appearing almost amused by the madness around him, as if he knew something they didn't. And while we would love to show pictures of this atmosphere, the truth is, much of the media and imagery from that era has been heavily censored, suppressed, or buried, part of the long tradition of trying to hide Jack Johnson's black legacy. But the story can't be erased, because on July 4th, 1910, as America celebrated its independence, Reno became the epicenter of a different kind of war, a war over who was allowed to be free. July 4th, 1910. While America waved flags and lit fireworks, Reno, Nevada was preparing for something darker. An arena in the desert became the center of the country's racial anxiety, like the whole nation had funneled its hatred into one boiling hot place. The heat was punishing. The sun felt like it was sitting on your shoulders. And still they came. 20,000 souls packed into that stadium, not just to watch a fight, but to watch what many believed would decide the natural order of the world. Out of those 20,000 spectators, only a few hundred were African American. The rest, they came with one purpose: to see Jack Johnson fall. The newspapers had built this moment like prophecy. The Great White Hope had arrived. Jim Jeffries entered to thunderous applause, carrying the desperate faith of millions. After 5 years of retirement, he dropped nearly 100 pounds for this moment, carving his body back down into a weapon. And he didn't just have a training camp, He had a mission. To Jeffries and to the white public behind him, this fight wasn't simply about reclaiming a title belt. It was about reclaiming control. It was about restoring a world where a black man wasn't allowed to stand above white men, especially not with the heavyweight crown shining on his waist. Every cheer Jeffries received sounded less like support and more like a demand. Fix this. Then Jack Johnson walked out, and the contrast was almost insulting to them. While Jeffries looked tense, serious, burdened, Johnson looked relaxed, almost playful. When photographers approached, Johnson posed for them like he had all day. That same maddening smile sat on his face, like the pressure of 20,000 hostile spectators was nothing. And in a way, it wasn't, because Jack Johnson had already fought for survival his entire life. A hostile crowd was familiar. A system built to break him was familiar, so the hate didn't shake him. If anything, it fed him. The bell rang, and the desert air filled with a sound that felt like the whole country exhaling at once. Jeffries came forward immediately, the betting favorite, trying to press Johnson. But Johnson moved with the grace of a man in total control. He slipped away from Jeffries' big, crushing swings like he had endless time to react, like he could see punches coming before they were even thrown. And for the first few rounds, something terrifying began happening for the crowd. Their champion couldn't touch him. Jeffries kept advancing. Johnson kept gliding. Jeffries kept swinging. Johnson kept smiling. And then Johnson began the part that broke people mentally. He started talking, constantly, smiling, laughing. He'd lean in, speak to Jeffries like they were having a casual conversation, like this was a sparring match, not the most politically charged fight in American history. He'd ask him questions, mock him, joke with him. He wanted Jeffries to understand. This wasn't fear. This was ease. This was confidence so deep it looked like disrespect, and the crowd, round by round, grew more restless, because the early rounds weren't going the way the story was supposed to go. The story was supposed to be Jeffries saving the day. Instead, Jeffries looked slow, heavy, frustrated. He started missing more, and every miss felt like another crack in the myth. As the brutal Nevada sun beat down, the two men circled in the center of the ring, but they were fighting for more than a championship. They were fighting for pride, for race, for history itself. Johnson's defense kept making Jeffries look helpless. Johnson's counters kept reminding everyone, skill beats rage. And the deeper the fight went, the more obvious it became. Jack Johnson wasn't surviving. He was dominating. By the later rounds, Jeffries was exhausted and marked up. Johnson was still talking, still smiling, still in control. And then it happened. The fight ended with Jack Johnson declared the victor. The great white hope was defeated, and just like that, the country snapped. Because the nightmare white America feared had become reality on the most symbolic day possible, Independence Day. A black man stood at the top of the world, and the backlash was immediate. When the fight ended, America didn't just argue. America erupted. In dozens of communities across the nation, white mobs attacked black neighborhoods, from Houston to New York, from Little Rock to Los Angeles. People were beaten, homes were burned, businesses were destroyed, lives were taken, simply because black citizens celebrated Johnson's victory. These weren't just sports riots. They were riots against black pride, a desperate reaction to what Johnson represented, because Johnson had done more than win. He had exposed the lie. And when they couldn't beat him in the ring, the system started looking for another way. They couldn't knock him out with fists. so they planned to crush him with law. When the riots died down, one truth remained. Jack Johnson was still champion, and that was unacceptable to the people who believed the world belonged to them. Because Johnson didn't just win a fight, he shattered a belief system on a public stage on America's most symbolic day. So the goal shifted. If they couldn't defeat him in the ring, they would destroy him outside of it. And the weapon they chose wasn't a fist. It was the law, or more accurately, the law twisted into a trap. By the early 1910s, America was in the grip of moral panic, a loud national obsession over prostitution, immorality, and what politicians called white slavery. Out of that panic came a new federal law, the Mann Act of 1910. On paper, it was meant to stop human trafficking and forced prostitution. In reality, it was broad enough to be abused because it criminalized transporting a woman across state lines for immoral purposes, a phrase so vague it could be shaped into whatever prosecutors wanted. And once Jack Johnson became the most hated black man in white America, they saw the Mann Act like a loaded gun lying on the table. All they needed was an excuse to pull the trigger. They started watching him, following him, waiting. Johnson's relationships had already been treated like national scandal, so prosecutors leaned into that. They accused him of traveling across state lines with his white girlfriend, Lucille Cameron. Their first attempt to prosecute Johnson over that relationship failed, but they didn't stop. They went digging, because when the system decides you're guilty, it doesn't search for truth. It searches for leverage. And in that search, they found someone from Johnson's past, Belle Schreiber, the same woman the press had used to smear him. They pressured her. They negotiated. They positioned her as their key. And then they built the case they wanted. In May 1913, Jack Johnson was put on trial under the Mann Act, charged with transporting Belle Schreiber across state lines for immoral purposes. An all-white jury listened, and the verdict? It took them less than 2 hours to convict, less than 2 hours to decide the fate of the heavyweight champion of the world. His sentencing judge was Kennesaw Mountain Landis, a man who would later become baseball's first commissioner and is notorious for presiding over an era in which baseball remained segregated. Landis sentenced Johnson to a year and a day in prison. A year and a day. For what? Not assault, not theft, not murder, for living outside the racial rules, for refusing to be controlled. The message was unmistakable. You can be champion, but you cannot be free. And Johnson understood exactly what was happening. So instead of submitting, he did what he'd always done. He defied the system. He fled. With Lucille Cameron, now his wife, Johnson escaped into exile. For 7 years, he lived as a fugitive. Imagine that, the heavyweight champion of the world, reduced to a wanted man because America couldn't tolerate his independence. He fought matches across Europe, Mexico, and Cuba, living on the move, staying one step ahead of the authorities. But exile isn't freedom, it's survival. And the longer he stayed away, the more his championship reign slipped into legend while his career slowly bled out. By 1920, Jack Johnson finally returned to the United States. He surrendered at the Mexican border. He served his sentence at Leavenworth Prison, and by the time he walked out, the truth was brutal. His boxing career at the championship level was effectively over. But even behind bars, Johnson never did what they wanted most. He never apologized. He never begged the public to forgive him for being who he was. He never pretended he was wrong for living like a man. He carried himself the same way he always had, upright, unbroken, and defiant, because that was the real threat of Jack Johnson. Not just that he could beat white men, but that he could beat them and still smile. And even after they took his freedom, his impact kept spreading. Because Johnson wasn't just an athlete, he became a symbol, a blueprint, proof that a black man could stand in the most hostile spotlight imaginable and refuse to bend. His legacy reached far beyond the ring. Every black athlete who followed, from Joe Louis to Muhammad Ali, walked through a door Johnson cracked open with his fists. From Jackie Robinson to Colin Kaepernick, generations of black figures who challenged America's rules were following a path Johnson carved through the wilderness of American racism. As one admirer put it, he had to be a courageous man, beyond just his boxing ability, because the real fight wasn't only against opponents, it was against the country, and decades later, even the government was forced to admit what had happened. In 2018, more than a century after those charges and 72 years after his death, President Donald Trump granted Jack Johnson a posthumous pardon, an official acknowledgement of what many had known all along, that Johnson's so-called crime was never really about immorality. It was about punishment. Punishment for being an unapologetically free black man in an America that wasn't ready to see one. But Jack Johnson's true legacy isn't in legal paperwork. It isn't in pardons or ceremonies or late apologies. It lives in the example he left behind. That one man, refusing to bend, refusing to break, refusing to apologize for excellence, can force the world to change around him. Jack Johnson never lived to see the America he helped shape, a world where black athletes would become champions, icons, leaders. But every time he stepped into that ring with that unforgettable smile, he was doing more than defending a belt. He was defending the right to be himself, unashamed, uncompromising, uncontrolled. And in the end, that may have been his greatest victory of all. Now here's what makes Jack Johnson's story even heavier. America didn't just hate him quietly, they made his hatred official. They turned it into headlines, sermons, speeches, and public morality. Because once Johnson became champion, he didn't just represent a problem in sports. He represented a problem in the white imagination. A black man at the top, smiling, wealthy, fearless, wasn't something the system could explain away. So it had to be attacked from every angle. Boxing commissions tried to limit him. Newspapers smeared him daily. Politicians used him as proof that black progress was dangerous. Preachers used him as a warning from the pulpit. Mobs used violence to punish black people for celebrating him. And the most poisonous part, they didn't only target Johnson, they targeted black communities through Johnson. Because every Johnson victory was like gasoline poured onto a racist society already burning. After the Jeffries fight, the scale of violence was so widespread that cities tried to shut down the flow of information itself. Some places banned the exhibition of fight films because the image of Jack Johnson beating Jim Jeffries was considered too dangerous for the public to see. Think about that. Not dangerous because it was violent. Boxing was always violent. Dangerous because it was a black man winning. Dangerous because it showed a truth they couldn't control. Dangerous because it might inspire the wrong people, black people, to feel pride. So the country reacted the same way oppressive systems always react. If you can't stop the event, you try to stop the memory. And that's why so much of Johnson's visual history feels scattered, missing, censored, lost. It wasn't an accident. It was policy. It was pressure. It was fear. And Johnson understood he was being hunted by more than prosecutors. He was being hunted by a culture that wanted to erase him. That's why his behavior, his swagger, his joy was so powerful, because they weren't just trying to defeat him. They were trying to break him, and he refused. But Exile changed things. For 7 years, Johnson lived outside the United States, fighting wherever he could. He wasn't just protecting his freedom, he was protecting his spirit. Yet even in exile, the money wasn't the same. The opportunities weren't the same. The heavyweight crown, once the center of the sport, became harder to hold on to from the outside. And while Johnson was away, boxing moved forward without him. New challengers rose. New promoters gained power. And the system, always adapting, found new ways to keep black fighters boxed out, even after Johnson had proven the color line could be broken. By the time he returned and served his sentence, the moment had shifted. But don't mistake that for the end of his impact, because what Johnson did wasn't a single victory. It was a crack in the wall. And once a wall is cracked, it never looks the same again. You can patch it, you can paint over it, you can pretend it's fine, but deep down, everybody knows it can break. And Johnson's life proved it. That's why every black champion who came after him carried both opportunity and warning. Joe Louis would be forced into a humble public persona, shaped carefully to be acceptable, because the country remembered what happened when Jack Johnson refused to act acceptable. Muhammad Ali would be punished for speaking freely, for refusing to be quiet, for refusing to play the role, because Jack Johnson had already shown what a fearless black man could do to the national psyche. Even beyond sports, Johnson's example echoed. Because he wasn't simply an athlete, he was a test case, a preview, a warning sign for the system. If one black man can stand in front of the whole world, refuse to bow, and still win, then what happens when millions do it? And that's why his story still feels so modern, because the pattern hasn't disappeared. The names change, the laws change, the language gets softer. But the core reaction stays the same. When a black figure becomes too influential, too free, too unapologetic, the system looks for a legal way to cut them down. That's why the Mann Act case matters so much. Not because it was rare, but because it was early. It was one of the clearest examples of American law being used as a weapon of racial control against a black man who wouldn't conform. And the sad part is, history often tells Johnson's story like it's just scandal, like it's just controversy. But it wasn't gossip. It was persecution. And that persecution didn't end with Johnson. It set a precedent, a template, a playbook, which is exactly why, even a century later, his name still makes people uncomfortable. Because Jack Johnson didn't just win fights. He forced America to look in the mirror, and America hated him for what it saw. And here's where the story gets even more revealing. Jack Johnson wasn't only fighting the rules inside boxing. He was fighting the rules of American identity, because the heavyweight champion wasn't seen as just an athlete. He was seen as the physical symbol of a nation. So when Johnson became champion, it didn't just embarrass white boxers. It embarrassed white supremacy. And white supremacy doesn't accept embarrassment. It retaliates. That's why the Great White Hope idea spread like wildfire. It wasn't a casual nickname. It was a national campaign. Newspapers didn't just report the search, they fueled it. They turned it into a crusade. And the language they used was barely coded. It was openly racial. They framed Johnson as an insult to the country. They described his victories as humiliations that needed to be avenged. They treated white fighters like soldiers being called to battle. One by one, white contenders were pushed forward to try to take the title back, and when they failed, they weren't just called bad boxers. They were called disappointments to their race, because in the public imagination, beating Jack Johnson wasn't a personal achievement. It was a racial duty. But Johnson was too good, too slick, too composed. He made challengers look foolish, and he seemed to enjoy it, which made the hatred multiply. And while the media was obsessing over the ring, something else was happening that made Johnson even more dangerous. Black America was watching. Black communities, often locked under Jim Crow terror, saw Johnson as a symbol of what they were denied, not just the belt, the dignity, the freedom to live loudly, the freedom to be seen. And that terrified the people who relied on black people feeling small. So the backlash became bigger than boxing. It became cultural. Cities, newspapers, and politicians tried to control Johnson's influence. Some states moved to ban the showing of his fight films because they understood the power of an image. A black man standing over a defeated white savior wasn't just a sports highlight. It was a visual sermon, and they didn't want that sermon preached. But even as they tried to suppress the footage, the story traveled. Word spread. Black barbershops, churches, and homes talked about Johnson's victories like forbidden scripture. Because in a country that spent every day telling black people they were inferior, Johnson was living proof that the lie could be shattered. And that's why the violence after his victories was so targeted. It wasn't random chaos. It was punishment, a warning. Don't you dare celebrate. Don't you dare feel proud. Don't you dare believe this means anything. But the more they punished black pride, the more Johnson's name became etched into black memory. And in an ironic way, the hate campaign made him bigger. Because when a system shows you how badly it needs you to lose, it accidentally proves how powerful your victory is. Now, while Johnson's personal life was weaponized against him, his boxing genius often gets reduced to highlight clips. So let's be clear, Jack Johnson wasn't just big and strong, he was ahead of his time. He fought with patience in an era where heavyweights were expected to charge forward like bulls. He used defense like a shield and offense like a knife, careful, deliberate, surgical. He controlled the pace. He controlled distance. He made men swing until they were tired and embarrassed, and then he punished them for it. That style became a blueprint for modern heavyweight boxing, and it's one reason so many boxing historians argue that Johnson changed the sport fundamentally. But here's what the mainstream version of history often leaves out. Johnson's brilliance wasn't celebrated. It was resented, because when white fighters fought smart, it was called strategy. When Jack Johnson fought smart, it was called arrogance. When white champions dated freely, it was called their private life. When Jack Johnson did it, it was called a threat to civilization. That double standard wasn't accidental. It was the whole point. Johnson wasn't allowed to be complex. He wasn't allowed to be human. He was either supposed to be a servant or a monster, and he refused both roles. That's why the Mann Act prosecution hit so hard. It wasn't only about punishing a man. It was about sending a message to every black person watching. Even if you reach the top, we can still reach you. But the message didn't land the way they hoped, because Johnson's life proved something deeper. If the system has to bend the law to stop you, if it has to rewrite morality to punish you, if it has to use courts instead of fists, then you've already exposed its weakness. And that weakness is exactly what later movements would exploit. Johnson's story becomes a bridge from the brutal spectacle of the battle royale to the coming civil rights era. Because he was living a truth before the country had language for it, freedom isn't granted, it's taken, and Jack Johnson took his. And if you really want to understand why Jack Johnson became such a lightning rod, you have to understand the America he was moving through. This wasn't some abstract racism. This was the era of lynch mobs, segregation signs, poll taxes, chain gangs, and the constant threat of violence for stepping out of line. In the South, black men could be killed for looking at a white woman the wrong way. In the North, black families could be boxed into ghettos, denied jobs, denied loans, denied safety, then blamed for the conditions forced on them. And in that America, Jack Johnson didn't just exist, he thrived, which made him an anomaly the system couldn't tolerate, because Johnson didn't act like a man who needed white approval. He didn't speak like a man who was afraid to offend. He moved like a man who believed he belonged wherever he stood. And that belief, more than any punch, was what made people furious. That's why the press covered him the way they did. Not just as a fighter, but as a problem. They put his name next to words like menace, scandal, danger. They painted him as a threat to society itself. But the truth is, Johnson was exposing something that was already there. A country that claimed to be civilized while functioning like a racial caste system. And Johnson kept shoving that hypocrisy into the spotlight. Every time he walked into a fancy restaurant in a tailored suit, every time he drove a flashy car through streets where black men were expected to move quietly, every time he smiled at white hatred like it was a joke. That smile wasn't just arrogance. It was the ultimate insult to racism. Because racism needs its targets to be afraid. It needs them to be ashamed. It needs them to shrink. And Jack Johnson wouldn't shrink. So the nation tried to manufacture a hero to replace him. That's where Jim Jeffries becomes so important, because Jeffries wasn't just a retired boxer. He was marketed as a symbol, as if the country had found a man who could restore things. The build-up to Reno was filled with propaganda. Newspapers described Jeffries like a savior. They framed the fight as a moral obligation. And by fight day, the atmosphere was less like a sporting event and more like a political rally. People didn't come to see technique. They came to see punishment. That's why the signs were so blunt. Save the white race. Kill the golden smile. There was no subtlety. And that's the part history books often soften. They'll say, racial tensions were high. No, they were openly declaring what they wanted. They wanted a black champion humiliated, hurt, erased, so that the country could breathe again. And when Jeffries failed, the riots proved the truth. The violence wasn't about boxing. It was about supremacy. Now here's something else that often gets ignored. Jack Johnson wasn't ignorant of the danger. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood the rules of the society he lived in. He just refused to accept those rules as legitimate. And that refusal, more than anything, made him historic. Because a lot of people think resistance only looks like marches or speeches. But sometimes resistance looks like a black man in 1910 living loudly, loving openly, spending freely, smiling endlessly, while the entire country tells him he doesn't deserve to. That's why Johnson became a cultural figure, not just a sports figure. He was a walking contradiction to the racial story America told itself. And contradictions force a choice: either change the story or destroy the contradiction. America chose destruction, and the Mann Act was the cleanest legal method they could find because it let them frame persecution as morality. It let them claim they were protecting women. It let them pretend the issue wasn't race, but the entire country knew it was because white men were crossing state lines with women all the time. White men were living openly immoral lives with no punishment. The difference was simple. Jack Johnson was black. Jack Johnson was famous. Jack Johnson was free. So they made an example out of him. And even then, Johnson's existence kept teaching a lesson. If you have to rewrite the law to stop somebody, that means the system is afraid of what they represent. And Jack Johnson represented a future where black excellence didn't come with apologies, a future where black men didn't have to bow their heads, a future where the color line didn't hold. And once that future is seen, even for a moment, it can't be unseen. And that's the part people miss when they tell Jack Johnson's story like it's just sports history. Jack Johnson was one of the first modern examples of a black public figure being punished not for what he did, but for what he symbolized. Because the heavyweight champion wasn't simply a champion. He was a living headline, a walking billboard, a national image. And when the national image became a black man with a gold-toothed smile, calm, confident, unbothered, white America reacted like the whole country was being disrespected. That's why the backlash wasn't limited to one city. It was nationwide. It's why people who didn't even care about boxing suddenly cared about boxing, because they didn't care about boxing. They cared about hierarchy. They cared about keeping the racial myth intact. And when the myth cracked, they panicked. That panic shaped how later black athletes were treated. Because after Johnson, America didn't want another black champion who lived freely. So when Joe Louis rose, the country, especially white media, crafted him into the opposite of Johnson. Louis was guided to appear humble, quiet, controlled. He was told not to be seen with white women. He was told not to smile too much after knockouts. He was told not to gloat, not to swagger, not to remind white America of Jack Johnson. Think about how revealing that is. A black athlete had to be coached in how to not scare white people, not because of violence, but because of confidence. Because Johnson taught the country that black confidence could be revolutionary. And the same pattern appeared again with Muhammad Ali. Ali wasn't punished because he was a boxer. He was punished because he was unapologetic, outspoken, and unwilling to be controlled. Ali's very existence, his voice, his refusal to bow, re-triggered the same kind of national anger Johnson had triggered decades earlier. Different era, same reaction. And you can trace that line forward again and again. Whenever a black figure becomes too loud, too proud, too free, too influential, the system looks for a lever, a rule, a law, a technicality, a way to make punishment look like order. That's why Johnson's conviction matters so much historically, because it shows how power operates. Not always with chains, sometimes with paperwork, sometimes with courtrooms, sometimes with juries that look exactly like the people who already hate you. Now about that trial, Johnson's case was not just a legal event, it was a performance. They wanted the public to see it. They wanted the public to feel like the problem was being handled, and they wanted Black America to feel the threat, because the Mann Act gave them a way to smear him as immoral instead of admitting they were targeting him for being a black man who refused to stay in his place. But the evidence of racial intent was everywhere. The press coverage was venomous. The language was racial. The obsession was not crime. It was interracial relationships. And the outcome, a quick conviction from an all-white jury, fit the pattern of Jim Crow justice. Johnson fled, and to many people at the time, that was spun as proof of guilt. But to anyone paying attention, it was proof of something else. Johnson knew the courts weren't going to give him fairness, because fairness wasn't the point. Control was, so exile became his only option. And even in exile, he stayed himself. He kept fighting, kept earning, kept moving. He refused to disappear quietly. But exile has a cost. It isolates you. It drains you. It steals your prime years. And that's exactly what the system wanted. They didn't only want to punish Jack Johnson. They wanted to waste him, to burn his best years down into survival and exhaustion, to make sure the man who shattered the color line wouldn't be able to fully enjoy what he'd earned. And when he finally returned and served his time, the punishment wasn't just the year in prison. The punishment was the lost momentum, the lost opportunities, the lost ability to remain the central figure in the sport. It was a slow form of erasure. Yet even with that erasure attempt, Johnson's impact didn't fade, because legends don't only live in trophies, they live in what they unlock. And Johnson unlocked something huge. He forced the nation to confront its fear of black excellence. He made the country reveal itself. And once a country reveals itself, you can't go back to pretending. That's why, decades later, the U.S. government had to acknowledge what happened. The 2018 pardon wasn't just symbolic, it was an admission that the law had been used as a weapon, an admission that the crime was really a pretext. But here's the deeper truth. A pardon can't give Johnson his years back. It can't undo the exile. It can't unburn the neighborhoods attacked after his victories. It can't unkill the black men murdered for celebrating him. So the real question isn't, was he pardoned? The real question is, why did it take America more than a century to admit what it did? And the answer is uncomfortable, because Jack Johnson's story isn't just about one man. It's about the country. It's about what happens when a black man becomes impossible to deny. And instead of changing, America tried to punish him into silence. It failed, because even now, over 100 years later, people still speak his name, and they still remember that smile. And that smile matters more than most people realize, because Jack Johnson didn't just beat men. He beat the script. He beat the role white America assigned him. He beat the expectation that a black champion had to be grateful, quiet, and cautious. That's why the smile became a target, not the belt, not even his fists. The smile, because the smile told the truth. He wasn't broken. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't begging for acceptance. He was enjoying himself on his own terms inside a country that demanded black suffering. That's why the famous line from Jack London hit so hard when he called for Jeffries to come remove that golden smile. It wasn't metaphor. It was a mission statement. And you can see the same psychology in how Johnson was covered in the press. When Johnson defended himself, they called him brutal. When Johnson celebrated, they called him arrogant. When Johnson dated, they called him dangerous. When Johnson married, they called him a threat. But when white fighters did similar things, it was romance, it was personal life, it was colorful personality. The double standard was the whole story, because Johnson wasn't simply being judged as a man. He was being judged as a boundary society wanted to keep intact. and he kept stepping over it like it wasn't there. Now, even with all the hate, Johnson wasn't perfect, and that's important because real history isn't clean. Johnson could be reckless, he could be impulsive, he could be provocative on purpose, but that doesn't change what happened to him. If anything, it makes the reaction even more telling, because white America didn't just want him to behave better. They wanted him to behave smaller. They wanted him to dim his lights. And Johnson refused, so they reached for law enforcement, the courts, and federal power. The Mann Act prosecution is often described like a simple moral case, but if you zoom out, it becomes obvious. It was a warning shot across the bow of every black person watching, a message that said, you can win, but don't get comfortable. You can rise, but don't think you're safe. You can be champion, but you'll still be punished if you act free. And the tragedy is that this tactic didn't stop with Johnson. It became part of the American toolkit, a way to destroy someone without making them a martyr, a way to ruin careers, isolate people, drain them financially, and exhaust them psychologically while claiming it's all legal. And yet, Johnson's name kept traveling, not just in black communities, but across global boxing culture, because there was no denying his skill. Even critics who hated his lifestyle couldn't deny what he did inside the ropes. He changed the heavyweight division. He introduced a style that forced fighters to think, to set traps, to control distance, to conserve energy. Johnson made power look elegant. He made defense look dominant. And that influenced the sport long after the newspapers stopped printing his name on the front page. But what's even more powerful is what Johnson did culturally. He proved that black excellence wasn't limited to survival. It could be luxury, it could be joy, it could be celebration, it could be leadership. And that might sound normal today, but in 1910 it was revolutionary, because the system didn't only want black people to be inferior, it wanted them to feel inferior. It wanted them to internalize the lie. Johnson refused the lie, and that refusal made him dangerous. That's why the reaction was so extreme. It wasn't enough to defeat him. They wanted to humiliate him. They wanted to criminalize him. They wanted to make sure that no other black man ever tried to live the way Jack Johnson lived. But history has a way of failing at that, because the very thing they tried to punish, black pride, black confidence, black freedom, became fuel for the generations that followed. Jack Johnson became a symbol of resistance, even if he never used that word. And later movements, civil rights, black power, modern athlete activism, could look back and see a clear ancestor, a man who stepped into the center of the American spotlight and refused to bow. Now, the story is often told like it ends with prison, like Exile and Leavenworth was the last chapter, but that's not the full truth, because Jack Johnson's influence didn't end when the system put him in a cage. The influence is what came after. The influence is what survived. The influence is how his story kept resurfacing again and again, every time America tried to pretend it had moved on. And that's why, even now, over a century later, the name Jack Johnson still carries heat. Because he wasn't just a champion, he was a confrontation. And if you're honest, you'll see the same confrontation still playing out today, just with different names. Different cameras, different laws, same pattern. And if you're wondering why this story still matters, why Jack Johnson's name still makes people shift in their seats, it's because his life forces a question America has never fully answered. What happens when a black man refuses to ask permission? Jack Johnson wasn't the first black fighter. He wasn't the first black champion in any sport, but he was one of the first to become a national obsession, and then refused to soften himself to make the nation comfortable. That's why the backlash was so vicious, because the system can tolerate black success if it comes with submission. It can tolerate a black champion who says, "Thank you, sir," and stays quiet. A black champion who never steps into the wrong neighborhood. A black champion who keeps his head down, keeps his joy small, and never makes white America feel challenged. But Jack Johnson, he didn't just win. He lived like he believed he had the same rights as everyone else. And in early 1900s America, that was treated like a crime. So they did what systems always do when they can't beat you fairly. They changed the battlefield. They turned the courtroom into a ring. They took a law created for morality and used it like a club. And that right there, the Mann Act case, is one of the clearest early examples of how justice can be shaped into persecution when the goal is control, not truth. Because be honest, if Jack Johnson had been white, the country wouldn't have cared. His relationships wouldn't have been treated like a national emergency. His marriage wouldn't have caused ministers to petition Congress. His travel across state lines wouldn't have become a federal crusade. An all-white jury wouldn't have rushed to convict. And the press wouldn't have framed him as a menace to civilization. They weren't prosecuting behavior. They were prosecuting defiance. They were prosecuting the image of a black man who smiled in their faces while they demanded fear. And they thought that if they could cage him, exile him, drain him, humiliate him, history would forget. But it didn't, because Johnson didn't just leave behind fight records. He left behind a blueprint, a path carved through a wall that was never supposed to crack. After him, the world could no longer claim black men weren't capable of being the best. After him, the heavyweight crown could no longer pretend it belonged to one race. After him, black America had a symbol that wasn't a whisper, it was a roar. And that roar traveled. You can see Jack Johnson's shadow in the way Joe Louis was managed to be acceptable. You can see it in Muhammad Ali's refusal to be quiet. You can see it in every athlete who understands that fame doesn't protect you, it just makes you a bigger target. You can see it in the way the system still tries to punish the people who won't play the role. Because the pattern is older than Johnson. You rise. They panic. They search for a legal way to cut you down. And if they can't erase your talent, they try to erase your story. That's why it matters that so many images and records from Johnson's era were suppressed or censored. They didn't just want him defeated, they wanted him forgotten. But history has a strange weakness. It can be delayed, it can be distorted, it can be buried, but it can't be killed completely. That's why, in 2018, more than a century after the case and decades after Johnson's death, the U.S. government finally issued a posthumous pardon. President Donald Trump granted Jack Johnson that pardon, acknowledging what so many already knew, that the prosecution was never really about protecting anyone. It was about punishing a man who was too free. But even that pardon has a bitter truth attached to it. A pardon can't undo the exile. A pardon can't unburn the neighborhoods. A pardon can't restore the years stolen from his career. A pardon can't bring back the black men killed for celebrating his victories. It can't erase the terror that followed him like a shadow. So Jack Johnson's real legacy isn't in official paperwork. It's in the fact that despite everything, the riots, the hate campaigns, the courts, the prison, he left behind something the system couldn't confiscate, An example. An example of what it looks like to refuse humiliation, to refuse shame, to refuse the demand to be smaller than your talent. Jack Johnson never lived to see the world fully change, but he helped force it to start changing. He helped carve a future where black athletes could be champions, icons, leaders, without having to pretend they didn't know their own worth. And every time you see a black athlete celebrated today, every time you see someone refuse to bow, refuse to apologize for excellence, refuse to shrink to make others comfortable, whether in sports, politics, music, or activism, you're seeing a piece of Jack Johnson's spirit still moving through the world, because that's what made him terrifying to the powerful. He didn't just win the belt, he made freedom look possible. So remember the scene, July 4th, 1910. 20,000 people in the desert sun, a nation holding its breath, white America praying for a savior, and Jack Johnson standing in the center of that storm, smiling, not because the hate wasn't real, but because he refused to let it own him. And in the end, that might have been the greatest victory of all. If you're watching this and you've never been taught this story the real way, share it. Because every time hidden history gets told out loud, the erasure loses power. And Jack Johnson, they tried to erase him. They failed.